Welcome to Quantum Potential, a podcast dedicated to curiosity, discovery, and the bold new ideas shaping our future. I'm Sibel Raver, Provost of Vanderbilt University. I'm thrilled today to welcome Professor Melanie Lowe, Associate Professor of Musicology here at Vanderbilt's Blair School of Music. Lowe received her PhD and her MFA in musicology from Princeton University after having attended Smith College as an undergraduate. Melanie's research focuses on constructions of musical meaning, spanning close analysis of classical music in late 18th century to the ways that we understand and make use of classical music now, to pop music currently in the 21st century. So cool, Melanie. She's just been named editor-in-chief for the Journal of Musicology Pedagogy, really signaling how much she thinks about and contributes to the ways in which we teach music theory, music history, and the playing of music. Melanie, your work spans so many layers of musical life, how listeners make meaning, how composers are signaling meaning through composition, but also through marketing their music, both in the 18th century and today, and how culture shapes what we hear. You've written about everything from, as I mentioned, late 18th century symphonies to the way that classical music is deployed in 21st century media. I think a lot about, the arias from Queen of the Night in The Magic Flute, where you hear that, regularly in weird ways, or music from Carmen. But then in a totally different direction, you've examined teen pop, tween girlhood, ironic masculinity, and the gendered performance of fandom, which I just love. When you're thinking about your scholarship as a whole, how do you describe yourself? Who are you? Are you a cultural historian? Are you a musicologist? Are you a critic of media and gender? How do you think about yourself?
I think I'm all of those things, but not all of them at the same time, is how I would answer that. I think the question that has guided all of my work is really the question of musical meaning. What does it mean? Can it mean? Should it mean? And if it does, how does that actually happen? And so if I'm working on 18th century symphonic music, I might go deep into a score. And if I'm thinking about the way that, let's say, tween pop is holding meaning or expressing whatever it has to say to 12-year-old girls, I'm not going to really show them a chart. I'm going to go talk to them and hear what they have to say. So I do all of those things depending on the particular context that I'm involved in at the moment.
It's so great. When you use the word go deep, it immediately made me think of some of your writing that talks about canon and canyon. And I love that you play with that word and this idea that you teach the canon. Mm-hmm. And I think of the canon as a fixed body of work that we all recognize has value. I think you use the phrase high art, but you also play with that in this idea of canyon. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So canon, of course, this accepted body of work, whether it's literature or music, that we hold up and celebrate and say, these are, the most illustrious examples of human creation. And how they got there is not because that's where they belong. They got to that position because somebody put them there, and people kept rehearsing that location. And so I play with this idea of the canon and the canyon, and also the canon, which is a musical technique where you have overlapping melodic lines that can just kind of over and over repeat each other, one after the other. They're identical, actually. And over time, just like the canyon, if you think of the Grand Canyon, it's just because that current just keeps flowing. And as it flows, it definitely reinforces the canon, but also exposes all of the layers that you can see in the meanings that the canon has taken over time. And it's not the same now as it was 200 years ago. And I love the idea that you can see all of the sort of meaning sediments, or sedimentary meanings, I guess, as you think about a canon moving through time.
That's so beautiful. And the quick example that I think of from your writing is that you have this lovely piece about what Suzuki method prioritizes as the first 3 partitas that all students have to learn, right? Mm-hmm. And Suzuki method, as I understand it, is when you get, incredibly tiny children like 3-year-olds to be learning classical music
Mm-hmm.
and tuning their brains and their fingers and their passion to play music early, which is such a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
And you do this amazing thing where you go back and look historically at the origins of those partitas, and specifically that one isn't written by Bach. And you just have this amazing way of looking at the sediment in the rock. Can you tell a little bit about that story of those musical notebooks? It's
Yeah,
just
sure.
It's lovely.
Sure. It's actually one of my most favorite pieces I've ever written because I think it speaks to musicologists, but it also speaks to moms that are playing that violin with their 3-year-old. So the 3 minuets in the Suzuki repertoire, pretty much every young musician is going to play these pieces, whether you're a trombonist or a violinist or a pianist. They are in the Suzuki repertoire, and most of our young musicians, certainly string players, this is how we train them now. Mm. The Suzuki method is based on the idea of using musical commonplaces that are in the air, that are in your ear. So everything from little tunes to popular melodies to little tunes that Suzuki composed. And they're all assembled in these books. And the 3 minuets, only one of them is actually by Bach, who for a long time got credit for all of them. And the original source is actually Bach's second wife's personal musical notebook. And she copied out most of the entries in that notebook. And she copied them because she was using it to teach her own children. And Bach famously had 20 children. 13 of them were hers. And her job was not just to run the household, but to teach the children music lessons.
Amazing. And also to transcribe his compositions.
Yeah, she was an excellent musician. She was a professional musician before marrying him. And so when she became the head of that household, she retained her identity as a musician and a singer and a copyist, but also became what I like to think of as the world's most celebrated musical mother. And then the idea that we have this collection of pieces that Anna Magdalena Bach used to teach her children. And here at the Blair School of Music, if you come into the Blair School in the afternoon, you're going to see all of these kids with their instruments, and they're playing those little pieces, and they're keeping company with the same kind of assortment of pieces intended for instruction of the world's youngest musicians.
So fascinating. And I love what you do there with time, right? Mm-hmm. That in telling that story, you bring us back in time to the, what was it, 1780s?
Mm-hmm. That notebook is 1725, actually.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. So what is that, 300
years
ago?
Right.
You know, that you're taking us into a moment where we imagine this woman who has a professional life. I think you mentioned that she's one of the highest paid, vocalists of her time.
Mm-hmm. She's a court singer, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. She's also the parent of somewhere between 13 and 20 children. And she's also navigating this really beautiful moment of teaching her own children how to play. Mm-hmm. And that you do that as an historian and as a musicologist, but also as a person committed to thinking about how we teach music.
Mm-hmm.
It's really cool.
I'll add one other footnote to that, if I might. Yeah. I also come to that piece as a musical mother myself. I had a daughter who studied piano through the Suzuki method and played that little minuet. And I remember myself as a child pianist playing that little minuet.
Wow.
And so there's this incredible history of that piece. And any person who studied music lessons probably knows this little minuet.
It's a vocabulary I don't know. And so I'm really impressed and interested to think about a world of people walking around with that vocabulary. Mm-hmm. And then when you think about that leap that you make in terms of your book, Pleasure and Meaning in the Classical Symphony, how to understand music composed in that time by those greats, by Mozart, by Haydn, by Beethoven, you explore how audiences of that era understood musical gestures. Can you tell us what you mean by the idea of musical gestures?
Sure. Musical topics is the language that I use for, I think, what you're talking about with gestures. And musical topics they're the materials of musical meaning and communication from this particular musical soundscape. So the everyday sounds of everyday life in 18th century Vienna, where this music was composed, you would be walking down the street and you would hear street songs, you would hear the fanfares at the court, you might hear dance music coming out of the dance halls, you would hear music, people playing coming out of the windows. So there's all of this music around. And what the composers at that time are doing is using the materials of these everyday commonplace musical moments, and they show up in a symphony or in a piano sonata or a string quartet. And when, let's say, a fanfare or a dance is imported into a piano sonata, it's going to carry with it the meanings and associations that gesture, that topic has taken on in a context completely external to where it shows up now. And so the reason that I got interested in this is I'm particularly interested in the meanings that people who are not trained in music hear today and then. Like, this music was performed in public concert halls, and only the landed nobility and upper middle classes and above would have known how to read music or think about music. And yet people enjoy this music. They heard something in it that made sense to them. It was intelligible. And this musical surface that's coming out of the sounds of their everyday world are the primary means of understanding and expressing for that particular audience.
So fascinating. I mean, I think in that early chapter, you talk about the popularity of that music, that it was not just popular in Vienna, not just popular in Paris, but popular in the United States, popular really in many different locations for many different classes of people. How do we now see that, right? It's not so popular to listen to classical music. It's
right.
The case that, Carnegie Hall is willing to give you a big discount if you're a younger listener to try to build a younger listening audience. How do we sort of mentally make sense of the idea of popularity, of the music having meaning now or having meaning then?
Yeah, that's actually one of the biggest questions that I've been working on answering. And I have one way of answering it in the book that we're talking about. And I think the biggest disconnect is the way that music was able to communicate with its original audience is lost to us because, of course, we don't have 18th century ears.
Yeah, there's no sea shanty singing in the streets.
Right, we don't walk
today
down West End and hear fanfares,
right.
or minuets coming out of the student dorms. I mean, it's an entirely different soundscape. So the real problem is that we don't have the sounds in our brains to make that kind of immediate association. And then the other difficulty is, I think ultimately the great irony that classical music has now become a topic in our own musical experiences. So how many television commercials trying to sell you a high-end product are going to accompany it with a top 20 classical music hit? You're going to hear Vivaldi while you try the hand model caresses gold coins.
There's like a piece out of Carmen that I hear every time a triumphant athlete comes on to.
Yeah. So that is topical expression. That is topical meaning. So you only need to hear a little bit of that triumphant sound to know what that music is telling you. But now the entire repertoire of late 18th century instrumental music just is classical music. Even though there's incredible variety in it, we hear classical music and it has a very specific meaning to us. And ultimately, I find that fascinating. First, I was sad because this is music that I love. And then I realized, wait a minute, I don't have 18th century ears either. So why am I able to enjoy this and so many people are not? And that's what settled me on the idea of trying to listen not just to what I call lay listeners or people who are not musically educated in the 18th century, but also today. Literally, what are you hearing? What does this mean to you? And ultimately, the idea that this music can't mean something if you are not musically trained is a really alienating idea that comes out of the 19th century movement. Music can only mean pure musical things.
Yeah, sort of segregated to a high art category.
Yeah, the meaning of music is purely musical. And then that goes into the 20th century. Musical meaning resides in its structures, in its forms. And if you don't have access to that, you can't understand it. But there's this whole other story going on the surface.
And is that there was some stripping away of the legitimacy of how the music made you feel?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. That
there
was a sentimentalist sort of vibe that we should not fall prey to.
Yes. The 19th century romantic gushing criticism made people profoundly embarrassed in the 20th century, which was this turn towards objectivity. And I want to reclaim the listener's subjectivity, the way that we can actually own and create and take great pleasure in our own control over the meanings of whatever the music is that we are listening to.
I love that you insert that pleasure is so key, and that it's about control over the narrative that's going on in our heads, rather than being told that it's good music, or it's being told that it's difficult music.
Right. That's exactly what's happened. We have been told from so many sources that classical music is elitist, it's boring, it's, not anything that you want to hear unless you're forced to go to the concert, which is not at all how this music originally functioned.
So fascinating. I think that would make a great segue for me to ask you to talk a little bit about teaching music, specifically to undergrads here at Vanderbilt. You have this wonderful set of exercises and this wonderful essay that I found extraordinarily funny, because you admit the difficulty of teaching the canon, teaching the whole shebang, and that you can't possibly get that done in 13 weeks. I think for any of us who teaches, that's always a feeling of sort of halfway between despair and, I'm sort of like, okay, I'm just going to teach my favorites. You do this really brilliant thing of asking students to break down what they think of as high art, or what counts as reasonable to include in the canon, which is kind of cool because you're bringing students into the creation, essentially, of what you're going to study. I thought maybe you could read this piece of your text that I've gone ahead and put some highlights on.
Sure.
So you ask the students a couple of questions, and I started with there.
Right. Can something that is accessible or goes down easy be high art? Can something that is produced for money, marketed, and sold for profit be high art? Can something that is entertaining be high art? Can something that is merely entertaining be high art? What do we mean by high art anyway? Do you want me to talk about the class discussions?
Yeah, there's a great class discussion.
In the many years that I've been at Vanderbilt, this is one of my absolute favorite teaching moments ever. So I'm really happy to read this to you. Great. It was great. So the students are talking about these questions. And as I've written it up, these class discussions are always quite lively. As the students reveal more of their perspectives and debate the questions, I become less of a discussion leader and more of a traffic cop. When the class approaches intellectual road rage, which usually happens around 40 minutes, I know we're truly getting to the heart of the matter, which, of course, is nothing short of the definition, meaning, and purpose of art. In a most revealing moment in one of these discussions, a composition major stood up, waved his arms, and shouted at his classmates, "Art is structure! Art is form!" He was very passionate, and the moment was terribly funny. But for a student so in touch with his inner Hanslick, this is a conservative romantic critic who was all about form. So for a student so in touch with his inner Hanslick, the more progressive ideas of some of his classmates were truly threatening. These were the people on whom he relied to perform his music and transmit his ideas, musical and otherwise, to his audience. In that moment, he also recognized that these students, his peers, were his audience. He was genuinely rattled by the realization that at the end of the day, he had absolutely no control over the ultimate meanings of his music.
It's just so great.
It was hilarious. He was very upset.
Yeah.
But, we learned from those moments where his entire sense of what he was doing was horribly shattered.
Yes, and also I think in that moment, it captures exactly what we want through initiatives like Dialogue Vanderbilt and our commitment to civil discourse, this idea that totally different viewpoints can exist in the same classroom, in the same conversation, in the same symphony, in the same, conversation between the audience and the composer, what the composer is intending, and what the audience is wishing to hear is so clearly possibly at odds.
Absolutely. And even when we have, let's say, documentary evidence that a composer says, this is my intention, my question is, how do we know they're telling us the truth? Why should we believe them? Is everything you write in your diary truly true and honest? So even when we think we know the intention, it's ultimately unknowable.
Yeah, just one layer of the sediment in that canyon trip.
Exactly.
Right?
Maybe the first. And then you see ultimately where the meaning is much, much further away from that surface creation.
And how do you navigate such different opinions in the classroom, right? That, you may have your own viewpoint, but just as one of my other quantum potential interviewees, Josh Clinton, doesn't share his political views as he calls the national presidential election, right? I would imagine you're in this really interesting position of authority, but you're navigating totally different opinions. How do you handle that?
Well, I can share an example from last night, actually, very, very briefly. I was teaching a course called Music and the Environment, and it's a course for non-majors. And our last exercise was a 42-minute listening indulgence to John Luther Adams' Become Ocean, which is an orchestral piece that it just has to kind of wash over you. It's a really amazing experience, but you have to commit to it.
Yeah.
And it's not everybody's cup of tea. But this is what we do on the last meeting of our 3-hour class in the evening. And so I have students lying on the floor listening, others with their heads down. That's perfectly fine. And at the end, they have to reflect on their listening experience. What was it like for you to listen to this 42-minute piece of music in the dark? And this isn't maybe your choice of music.
Yeah, no cell phones, I'm assuming.
Right. No cell phones, no talking. I mean, it is a listening indulgence, as I tell them. And their first thing they have to do is just reflect, brain dump. What was that experience like? And I tell them, I personally love this composition. I've listened to it so many times, and every time I come out feeling different at the end of it. That said, you might have thought it was the worst 42 minutes of your semester, and you would love to have those 42 minutes back. And if you absolutely hated every second of this, great. Tell me about it and tell me why. That's what I want to hear. And so I really, do share my enthusiasm for a piece of music, and at times even my dislike for a piece of music. And also I'm unabashed that this is my opinion, and I love a good argument about it. And I can't wait to hear what, especially people who don't know anything about this music, it taps into my fascination with, what I think of as the lay listener, people who are not trained in music or musically initiated. What do you hear?
On the next Quantum Potential, AI's power to correct hearing loss and the future of AI-enhanced medical devices. We'll talk with Jack Noble, an assistant professor of electrical and computer engineering, who combines his expertise in computer science, biomedical engineering, and hearing and speech sciences to revolutionize the efficacy of cochlear implants. But first, let's get back to my conversation with Melanie. I think it's also incredibly democratizing in that way, right? Not only is it that you have, you're not required to have a vocabulary to be able to engage in thinking about this music, but you're not required to have liking of it be the ticket of entry, to have a conversation about it.
Right. And one of my other favorite moments from this past semester is very early in the semester, I play a really big orchestral piece by a composer named Joan Tower. It's called Sequoia, and it's her musical portrait of the sequoias. And I had a bunch of guys that were just lying on their backpacks on the floor listening to it, and afterwards just went, "That was awesome!" It just shocked me.
Unbridled,
not at all what I expected. I expected what I think people think they're going to hear in an orchestra concert, which is ho hum. And that these guys were
those minutes back, right?
Yeah, no, these guys were really totally into it. Yeah. They were stunned that they were so into it. And that was
That's great.
really affirming. That was wonderful. They might want their 42 minutes back from last night. I don't know.
No, but I think that way in which how to sharpen one's viewpoint so that you feel like you can not only participate, but shape others' views, have your own views change, right? That I'm sure over the course of the semester, what students initially walk into with their own priors about the material that you're going to introduce them to changes. And at least that's what we would hope in a university setting, right? That it's not just, oh, I learned to appreciate, but I now have much more fully formed viewpoint and opinion
Right.
than
And
I did.
I think teaching non-majors music is largely about the experience. This is music. So when I set them up for this 42-minute listen, I say, this is an experience that you are likely never going to have again, and you likely would not have had if you didn't take this class. So I want you to fully commit to it.
That's great.
Let's do it.
If we're going to do it, let's really do it. Yeah. It's very, very cool. And then how does that translate to teaching about popular music? Is it that those classes are just extraordinarily high in their enrollment and students come in totally excited that they get to think about Taylor Swift and tweens loving music? Like is there a polar difference between how students come into your classrooms in terms of their anticipation and expectations around classical music versus popular music?
Yeah, I'm probably not going to be able to answer that particularly well for today because I actually haven't taught those big classes on popular music for a while. But I do teach a class that has a mixture of classical and popular music, largely for music majors. And so when we get to Beyonce, for example, they loosen up.
Interesting.
And I don't know whether it's because it's sort of their music more than my music, or that's what they think anyway, and that might not entirely be accurate. But yeah, they're a little more relaxed. They take a little more ownership of it. And they also, I think, know that I might not be the expert on that they are.
So interesting.
And that's fine.
Yeah, expertise matters walking into the classroom.
Yeah. And also, I'm really upfront about, especially when we get into music that is not music that I'm an expert on, but I'm teaching anyway because it has a pedagogical purpose in that moment. So yeah, I tell them I want to learn from you. And they have a lot to say. They have a lot to share.
That's great.
Yeah.
In terms of thinking about listening, particularly early experiences of fandom for girls and how girls experience a sense of desire or empowerment in listening to music, tell us a little bit about your work in that area.
Okay, that's interesting because it is also connected to what I'm doing in classical music. It's ultimately the same question. How does this music mean something to the listener? And what we think it's meaning, if we're on the outside, we're not the actual listening subject, the person who thinks they know what this music means, that is likely not what the listening subject is actually experiencing. And so this is kind of going way back, but I did this work when Britney Spears had come out as this very young looking, 16-year-old looking girl in her school uniform, and was obviously sort of a very sexualized portrayal. A lot of moms getting a little upset about the music and the imagery that their young daughters are consuming. 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds idolizing.
Right. I remember the parent advisory stickers.
Oh, yeah.
I was that generation of,
her image on all the magazines. But I actually talked to the girls themselves, and I did some focus group work and just played some music, and we talked, and I listened to what they had to say. And at the end of that, they are really savvy media critics. So on the one hand, they are completely aware of what the media is doing to the image. They know, oh, she might be like that or she might not, but this is how she's being made to look. So they understand that. So on the one hand, they understand that. On the other, they don't like it. They are perfectly, a 10-year-old is perfectly capable of calling that out and saying, yeah, she's being objectified. She might not use that exact word, but that's what she's saying.
Yeah.
But then the really interesting thing is when those girls get behind closed doors and the parents aren't there and their brothers aren't there, and it's just a couple of, let's say, 10-year-old girls lip syncing, playing the music, singing along with it, dressing in clothes and moving their bodies in that way. The way I read it is they are actually practicing their own kind of nascent sexuality in a very safe, space, which is their own private bedrooms.
Right. There's just something really awesome about music happening in private spaces,
Yeah.
whether it's your earphones or in the car or in your bedroom as a teenager. Really an interesting observation, right? It's very different than if you go to a concert publicly.
Right. And that music meant different things to them at different moments.
Yeah.
Depending on where they were or how old they were or what and this gets back to the idea of the listener's control over meaning. That's the pleasure in this music. The girls took a lot of pleasure in this music, especially when they were controlling its meanings.
And I can think about yacht rock or music that appeals to, older listeners who just want to be able to go back in time in their own heads, right? In the sense of the pleasure of having control over that feeling. It's a great kind of connection that you've made between sort of a more affective, emotional way of thinking and a more cognitively analytic frame. It's very fascinating to me.
Thank you. Thank you.
And then tell me a little bit about ironic masculinity. I'm totally captivated.
Oh, ironic masculinity. This actually came from listening to a bunch of synth pop and hearing electric guitars and realizing that those electric guitars were performing a kind of ironic masculinity. If we think about the usual signification of an electric guitar, it's basically a phallic object, right? And we've got the power chords, and we have the kind of wall of sound. It is a very powerful masculine musical symbol. And here we have these synth pop, defiantly not masculine male performers.
Totally.
Embracing the sound of the electric guitar in a way to throw shade on its usual meaning.
Yeah.
And so using it in a not always campy, but sometimes, but definitely, or embracing it with earnest, just being really serious about this electric guitar, which ultimately shows the hollowness of the symbol.
The whole meaning of shredding, right?
Yes.
And if a woman shreds on an electric guitar, what does that mean? And if a guy shreds on an electric guitar, what does that mean? And if a guy with a woolen beanie stands with his 5 o'clock shadow and does not shred emphatically. What does that mean? I think it's just
a performer in like full stage makeup and really flamboyant costumes, but has the symbol, but he's shredding,
right?
And it's really incongruous, which is ultimately, to me, the ironic masculinity, and ultimately reclaiming that masculinity is multifaceted.
Right. Just to say,
right, exactly. Just because you choose not to play music with electric guitars and it's all synth, does that mean that it's feminine or not masculine? So I think at the end of the day, it's really expanding our sense of what is masculine.
It's great.
Masculinity in music.
It's certainly, I think, a huge question that constantly comes up now, and particularly, I think, I would say in cinema studies and gender studies. And I'm curious about the ways in which you collaborate across campus in terms of faculty and other departments. Is that a conversation that they recognize is true in music and musicology as we might in thinking about media studies or cinema studies or other fields?
I think that's an area of collaboration that really needs more development. And there is a sense, because music requires a certain kind of education. You need to be able to read music, or that's the very traditional training. And it's been a kind of perennial problem that music and musicology and the academic study of music is somehow separate from the study of other art expressions, literature, painting. And for that reason, I think there is always a little bit of a gap that needs to be closed in terms of what musicologists do and what other people in the humanities working on artistic topics. So I would say there's a lot of potential for collaboration that personally I have not really engaged very much in.
really curious, for example, about the way in which algorithms used by Spotify and other platforms shape musical taste, right? And the ways in which what we, again, per your point earlier about what we listen to in terms of classical music, what we get exposed to or how we make meaning of music in the future. For what I would draw from what you're saying is that it's going to be affected dramatically by what we're exposed to, what we perceive as sort of the standards of our day.
I think we're kind of being told what we like by the algorithm. And if we sort of take my idea of the listener's control over meaning and the pleasure that we take in that, it's a similar kind of path. When we became told what, let's say, 18th century symphonic music meant to us, it meant dull, it meant old, it meant boring, it meant elite. If we kind of farm out too much of our control over our choices or what we decide something means or how we interpret it, I worry that the actual expression will be vastly diminished.
Yeah.
And the pleasure, certainly.
It makes total sense to me, especially based on the sort of themes that you've outlined. And the other theme that immediately comes to mind is the theme of making time. You've talked a lot about that in the article about teaching, that you just need enough time for students to be able to really, really immerse themselves in that music. And you've talked about that today, this idea that it's an indulgence. How do you think about students committing to listening to an album in analog form or listening to, 42 minutes by a single composer? Do you have a sense of hope or a sense of concern around the ways in which we have time and time stretches versus we don't have time and time compresses when we listen?
One of the things I talk about a lot in my teaching is how we are temporal beings and music is a temporal art. And the music on the page is actually just a reification of something that doesn't exist in that medium. So the music, the actual sheet of music, is a spatial object. And it's simply a set of instructions for realizing a temporal experience. So I have really kind of mixed feelings about it. It's wonderful that our students are listening to music all the time. If you can't walk across campus, every single person you pass has earbuds in, and they're in their own private musical space or podcast space or whatever it is they're listening to. So they're listening more and more and more. I'm not entirely sure that they are listening attentively as much as perhaps certainly a music instructor would like them to.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's like a film score, right? If I'm walking through campus or doing something and I have earphones in, my life is being scored. I have a soundtrack that's, and I think you're absolutely right. I'm not necessarily attending in the same way as if I were in your class lying on the floor listening. And that's the only thing I was doing at the time.
And of course, that's fine. I mean, there's different reasons we listen to music. There's different listening modalities. I would really like to hope that we haven't lost the pleasure to just sit and listen to music and really do nothing else. That is an indulgence. And I think our lives are so cluttered and noisy and busy. We think we can listen and run. We can listen and cook. We can listen and do homework. We can listen and walk to class. But when are we just listening to ourselves listen?
Totally. The listening room, the listening hour. I love that idea. Thank you so much, Melanie. I was really just thinking as you were speaking about what gives you hope going forward. I've been asking this question in my interviews just because I think it's useful to frame what we do in the university as having impact in the world and in many cases having solutions.
I think what gives me hope, at least in the realm of the university that I hang out in, which is the Blair School of Music, our students are genuinely curious about the music of the world, not just the music that's in their studio or the music that they've grown up playing. And I think the more that we can inspire students that are here largely to study classical music to understand that the music that they are committing to learning and studying and performing is in a constant dialogue with the music of the world in a way that it never has been before, because they have pretty much the world's recorded music or at least access to it in their pocket.
Yeah, incredible.
And we have never had a moment like that before.
Yeah, that is amazing. The level of globalization and fluency and world culture, fascinating. And if there's one thing that you wanted to advise our listeners or tell our listeners something to leave them with, what would that be?
Do the musical indulgence. Listen and listen to yourself listen, and don't do anything else at least once a day, even if it's just a 2-minute pop song.
Wonderful.
Just listen and stop doing anything else.
I love that. Thank you for that gift. Thanks so much, Melanie, for joining us today.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. The Quantum Potential podcast comes from Vanderbilt University. I'm your host, Sibel Raver, Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs with Vanderbilt University. Thank you to our guest, Melanie Lowe, Associate Professor of Music at the Blair School of Music. This episode was edited and mixed by the team at Sound On, Sound Off. You can learn more about their work at soundonsoundoff.com. For more information about quantum potential, go to vanderbilt.edu/quantum potential. Thank you for joining us today for the Quantum Potential podcast. Stay tuned for more conversations with the thinkers and innovators reshaping our world. I'm Sibel Raver, and this has been Quantum Potential.